There was a library at the heart of the Toada mansion that most people forgot existed. It sat behind a pair of heavy iron doors on the east wing of the fourth floor, tucked so far from the main corridors that even longtime staff members sometimes walked past it without knowing what was on the other side. The doors had no sign, they had no decoration, they were just iron, cold, flat, and permanent, like a boundary between the world that made noise and the world that did not. And inside that world of silence, surrounded by shelves that climbed all the way to a ceiling most people never looked up to see, lived the young man named Ren Ashida. Ren was 27 years old, and he had never made a single sound in his entire life. Not a cry when he was young, not a laugh when something amused him, not even a sharp breath when something startled him. He was mute, completely, naturally, and permanently, and he had long ago stopped feeling sad about it. Silence was simply the language his body had been given, and over the years he had learned to use it with extraordinary precision. His eyes said more in one slow blink than most people communicated in an entire sentence. His hands, when he chose to use them, moved with the kind of careful purpose that made people feel they were watching something important happen. His notebook, a small, dark-covered thing that he kept tucked in the front pocket of his coat at all times, was filled with neat, even handwriting that somehow always managed to say exactly the right thing in the fewest possible words. He was not a person who wasted anything, not space, not time, and certainly not language. The library he lived in and worked in was by any measure one of the most remarkable rooms in the entire mansion. The shelves were made of dark, polished wood that had been built directly into the stone walls, so they looked less like furniture and more like the building had simply grown them there over centuries. The books themselves were extraordinary, thousands of them, ranging from fragile ancient texts wrapped in protective cloth to newer volumes with clean spines and sharp-edged pages. There were books in 6 different languages. There were hand-drawn maps of cities that no longer existed. There were personal journals from family members going back 4 generations, their handwriting growing spidery and faint with age. And there were, kept in a locked glass case in the far corner of the room, a small collection of record books, thick, serious-looking volumes with plain covers that contained something far more valuable than any story or map. They contained the private history of the Toada family's dealings, names, dates, locations, agreements, everything that had ever been decided, promised, or exchanged. The kind of information that in the wrong hands could destroy not just a family, but an entire network of carefully maintained power. Ren knew every single book in that library by memory. He knew their positions, their conditions, their histories. He knew which ones had been repaired and which ones needed to be. He knew the smell of the oldest ones, dry and faintly sweet, like pressed flowers that had lost their color but kept their shape. He had cataloged everything within 3 months of his arrival, built a filing system so logical and so complete that finding any single document in that room took less than 2 minutes. He was exceptional at his work, and he knew it, though he would never have written that about himself in his notebook. He simply did the job as thoroughly as it deserved to be done, because anything less would have felt dishonest. He had arrived at the Toada mansion 4 years ago. He had not come willingly, but he had not come fighting either, because Ren Ashida had learned very early in his life that fighting a situation you cannot change is just a way of exhausting yourself before the real difficulty begins. He had been sold as a young adult by a distant relative who had decided his silence made him inconvenient, and he had been purchased by Elder Toada, the cold and ancient head of the Toada family, who needed someone quiet and trustworthy to manage the private library. Ren had been that person. He had been it every single day, without complaint, without recognition, without anyone in the mansion ever really stopping to understand that the quiet young man in the East Wing library was one of the sharpest and most observant minds in the entire building. He organized his days around the books. He woke before the sun rose, washed his face, put on his coat, and walked the familiar route to the library before anyone else in the mansion was moving. He spent the early morning hours in comfortable quiet, checking the condition of the most fragile volumes, making notes about anything that needed attention. By midday, he would eat a small meal alone at his desk, always something simple, always something that left no crumbs near the books. In the afternoon, he read, not for pleasure only, though pleasure was certainly part of it, but because understanding what was in the books was part of how he protected them. And in the evenings, he wrote long, careful notes about the collection, its condition, its history, cross-referencing entries in a way that would have impressed archivists with decades of formal training. He did not have friends inside the mansion. This was not a tragedy he dwelt on, but it was a truth he understood completely. Most of the staff found his silence uncomfortable. They did not know how to speak to someone who could not speak back, and so they simply did not speak to him at all. Guards nodded when they passed him in the corridor. Kitchen staff left his meals outside the library door without knocking. Even Elder Toada, who had specifically chosen Ren for his role, communicated only through written instructions left in a sealed envelope once a week. Ren read them, fulfilled them, and filed them. That was the entirety of his relationship with the man who controlled his daily life. And so Ren had built his world inside the library, and the library had been enough, or at least he had decided it was enough, which is a thing people do when they have spent a long time not being given more. Then, on an otherwise remarkable afternoon in the deep middle of autumn, the 5 Alphas arrived at the mansion. They came like weather. Not loudly, but with the kind of weight that changed the feeling of the air the moment they entered. The mansion's usual staff seemed to stand straighter when they passed. Guards who had worked there for years spoke more formally in their presence. Even Elder Toada, who treated most people with a kind of bored kind of authority, received them with something closer to genuine attention. They were, by every measure, the most trusted and the most capable people the Toada family had access to, and the fact that Elder Toada had called all 5 of them at once meant that whatever had happened was serious. Their names were Kaito Mori, Zane Fujita, Haru Saeki, Ryo Nakamura, and Sora Date. They ranged in age from 25 to 30, and they had been working together long enough to know each other's habits, preferences, and limits better than most people know their closest companions. Kaito was the oldest and the leader, quiet in the way that deep rivers are quiet, with a current underneath that you only understood when you stepped in. He gave instructions in short, precise sentences and never repeated himself because he trusted the people around him to listen correctly the first time. Zane was the one who filled every room he entered with a kind of restless warmth, always moving, always talking, always somehow holding a snack even in situations where snacks seemed completely inappropriate. He was also, underneath all the noise, intensely loyal and surprisingly perceptive, which was a combination most people underestimated because they were too busy watching him eat. Haru was tall and broad-shouldered and gentle in a way that seemed almost paradoxical until you understood that his gentleness was a choice, not a default. He was fully capable of being formidable, and everyone around him knew that, which was exactly why he was able to be so consistently soft. Ryo was precision made into a person, organized, strategic, always 3 steps ahead of whatever situation he was in, with a mind that processed information the way a very good machine processes data, quickly, completely, and without sentiment getting in the way. And Sora was the youngest, curious in the way that young people are curious when they have not yet learned to be embarrassed by their own interest in things. He drew in the margins of his notebooks. He noticed small details that others walked past. He asked questions that sometimes seemed random, but were almost always connected to something important. Elder Toada told them about the missing pages on the evening of their first day at the mansion. Someone had been removing single pages from the family record books, not taking whole volumes, which would have been noticed immediately, but extracting individual pages with such care that the loss was only visible on close inspection. The thefts had been happening over many months. The removed pages were not random. They all came from one specific record book, and taken together, they formed a complete picture of certain private dealings that the Toada family had never intended to be seen by outside eyes. If those pages had already been copied and sold, the consequences would be severe. Elder Toada wanted the person responsible found before any more damage could be done. It was Zane who found the library first, though he would later describe it as the library finding him, which was the kind of thing Zane said when he wanted to sound more interesting than the truth allowed. He had gotten genuinely lost looking for the kitchen.
The mansion was enormous, and its layout was not logical, and he turned left when he should have turned right and found himself standing in front of a pair of heavy iron doors. He pushed one open out of curiosity, because Zane Fujita had never once in his life seen a closed door and not wanted to know what was on the other side. What was on the other side was Ren. Zane stood in the doorway and looked at the most quietly extraordinary thing he had encountered in some time. The young man at the desk was completely absorbed in what he was doing, sorting through a stack of documents with a system that, even from across the room, was clearly meticulous. His movements were economical and sure. His focus was total. He looked, Zane would tell the others later, like someone who had been doing exactly this work for so long that it had become part of who he was, the way breathing becomes part of who you are. When Ren finally looked up and saw him, there was no alarm in his expression. There was caution, carefully controlled, and behind it a watchfulness so complete that Zane had the sudden and slightly uncomfortable sensation of being assessed very thoroughly by someone who was very good at it. Zane opened his mouth to ask about the kitchen. Ren reached for his notebook, wrote a single line, and slid it across the desk with a smooth, practiced motion. The note gave him perfect directions, including the detail about sesame, which turned out to be entirely accurate. But Zane did not leave right away. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at the careful arrangement of books and the small, neat desk and the young man who had already returned his full attention to his work, and he felt something settle in his chest, a certainty, quiet and a little surprising, that this person was going to matter to them. He could not have explained it. He simply felt it the way you sometimes feel that a conversation is going to be important before it has properly begun. He told the others about Ren that night in the room they had been given to use as their base of operations. He described him plainly: young, mute, works in the library, knows where the kitchen is. And each of the others responded in a way that was, in hindsight, entirely consistent with who they were. Rio immediately wanted to know what Ren's access to the record books was. Haru asked whether Ren seemed comfortable or distressed. Kaito said nothing for a moment, and then asked Ren to describe the way he moved. Sora asked whether Ren knew sign language, and when Zane said he did not know, Sora opened his phone and started looking up beginner tutorials before anyone else had finished speaking. Over the days that followed, the 5 Alphas crossed paths with Ren repeatedly, and each encounter added a layer to what they were slowly understanding. Rio noticed the filing system first, not just that it was excellent, but that it was the kind of excellent that took real intelligence to design, not just diligence. Haru noticed the chair placement, always with the back against the wall, always angled toward the door, the posture of someone who had spent years in situations where knowing the exits mattered. Kaito noticed the way Ren tracked all 5 of them every time any of them entered the library, never obviously, never with any outward sign of anxiety, but completely. He always knew where each of them was.
Zane noticed that Wren's notebook had a second, smaller notebook tucked inside the back cover, filled with a different kind of writing, more personal, less functional, the kind of writing a person does when they are processing rather than communicating. And Sora came every evening and sat nearby and read, because that was what felt right, and because he had started making slow and earnest progress with sign language and wanted to be close enough to practice when Wren was willing. The evening Sora slid a piece of paper across the desk asking to practice is the evening that something shifted. Not dramatically, nothing cracked open, nothing changed in the air. It was much smaller than that. It was the moment Wren looked at the note and then looked at Sora for a long time with an expression that was not quite readable but was doing a great deal of work inside, and then wrote back that Sora would make many mistakes. The warmth in that response, the acknowledgement that there would be a next time, that Sora's offer had been accepted even while being gently warned against overconfidence, was the kind of warmth that Wren allowed to exist only because it could be contained within the clean borders of notebook paper. Sora smiled so wide that Wren looked briefly startled by it. That night, late, after the library had gone dark and Wren had returned to his small room on the east wing, a staff member named Ogawa knocked on Elder Toada's door and delivered a report. He spoke for several minutes. Elder Toada listened, face unreadable. The meeting ended, and both men went their separate ways, and none of the 5 Alphas knew anything about it until the following evening, when Rio went to the library to ask Wren about the record book cataloging system, and found the iron doors standing slightly open, the golden light on, Wren's coat draped neatly over his chair, his notebook sitting closed on the desk, and the room completely empty. One book lay on the floor, face down, pages bent, the kind of drop that happens when someone leaves quickly. Rio stood still for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pressed the communication channel and said in a voice that was controlled but carried an unmistakable edge, "The library boy is missing." The response from Kaito was immediate. It was 4 words, but the 4 words carried the weight of someone who had just decided, without fanfare and without hesitation, that whatever else was happening in the mansion that evening was now secondary. Find him, right now.
There is a specific quality to the kind of search that happens when 5 highly trained and deeply motivated people decide that nothing else matters until a single person is found. It does not look frantic from the outside, though it moves with tremendous speed. It looks, instead, like a building thinking, every part of it moving in coordination, each piece doing exactly what it was made to do, all of it oriented toward a single purpose. That was what the Toada mansion became for the next 2 hours, a building thinking, with 5 people as its mind. Kaito took the upper floors. He moved corridor by corridor, opening every door that was not locked and standing quietly at the entrance of every room for a moment before moving on. Not just looking, but listening, sensing, reading the particular quality of silence in each space the way a person reads a page. He had learned long ago that silence was not uniform. Empty silence sounded different from occupied silence. A room that had recently held a frightened person had a specific feeling to it, a residual tension in the air, like the echo of a held breath. He found 2 rooms that felt that way, but yielded nothing more. He kept moving. Zane took the ground floor and the staff quarters. He moved fast, talking to everyone he encountered, not interrogating them exactly, but asking questions in the easy conversational way he had that made people answer before they had thought about whether they wanted to. He learned 3 things: that Wren had been seen in the east corridor approximately an hour before Rio found the empty library, that a staff member had been dismissed from duty unusually early that afternoon, and that 2 kitchen workers had heard what they described as a raised voice from somewhere on the 4th floor around the same time. None of these facts were conclusive. All of them mattered. Haru went to the exterior, the gardens, the greenhouse, the covered courtyard, the maintenance corridors that ran along the outside of the building like a secondary skeleton. He moved through each space with the careful attention he brought to everything, checking not just the obvious spaces, but the corners and the small sheltered places that a person who had grown accustomed to going unnoticed might instinctively move toward. The greenhouse yielded nothing but the smell of warm earth and the soft rustling of plant leaves in the ventilation current. The courtyard was empty. The maintenance corridors were dark and cold and unoccupied. Haroun noted the cold and thought about Ren's coat still hanging over his chair upstairs, and moved faster. Rio went to the security room and pulled every camera feed from the previous 2 hours. He watched them with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times, fast-forwarding through the footage, slowing at every moment that contained movement, building a timeline in his head of where Ren had been and when. He found him on 2 cameras, once in the east corridor, walking quickly and alone, carrying nothing, and once, briefly, partially obscured by a pillar, near the entrance to the library. After that, nothing. The cameras showed no further trace of him, which meant either Ren had gone somewhere the cameras did not cover, or the cameras had been interfered with. Rio printed the timestamps and tucked them into his folder and went to find the others. Sora went back to the library. This was not a failure of strategy. It was in fact exactly the right instinct, which was something Sora often had without always being able to explain why. He sat down at Ren's desk and looked at the room the way Ren would have looked at it, as a collection of information, each object positioned for a reason, each gap or displacement meaningful. He looked at the notebook on the desk, he looked at the coat, he looked at the book on the floor. Then he looked at the book on the floor more carefully, because something about it was specific in a way that felt intentional. It was open to a chapter about architectural concealment, hidden rooms, structures built within structures to create spaces that did not appear on any official record. Sora picked the book up slowly. He read the open page. Then he looked up at the walls of the library and began to move around the room, running his fingers along the edges of the shelves with the patient attention of someone looking for a specific kind of imperfection. He called the others in when he found the gap. It was behind the tallest shelf, narrow enough that it would have been invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. A seam in the wall that was not quite a seam, a darkness that was slightly different from the shadows around it. Behind it, when the shelf was carefully moved aside, was a stone staircase going down at a steep angle into a space that smelled of old cold air and years of disuse. All 5 of them stood at the top of the stairs for a moment. Then Kaito went first, and the others followed, and at the bottom of the stairs they found a room that time had clearly agreed to leave alone. Covered furniture, an old rug filmed with dust, walls of bare stone, a single oil lantern that someone had found and lit at some point in the distant past and that had long since gone out. And in the far corner of the room, on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up against his chest and one arm wrapped tightly around himself in the way people hold themselves when they are trying not to come apart, was Ren. He was clutching a single page of paper against his chest. His notebook was upstairs on the desk. He had no way to write, no way to sign, no way to communicate anything except through the expression on his face, which in that moment contained several things simultaneously: fear, determination, exhaustion, and underneath all of it, held so carefully that it was almost invisible, something that looked like relief from not being alone anymore, even though he had not yet decided if it was safe to feel it. Back in the library, with his notebook returned and a glass of water that Haru had gone to get without being asked, sitting at his elbow, Ren wrote the truth in careful, unhurried sentences. He had not taken the pages.
He had discovered 7 months earlier that someone else inside the mansion had been systematically photographing the record books, not removing pages originally, but building a photographic record of their contents to sell to an outside party. Ren had found evidence of this by accident, a camera lens that had been left in the gap between 2 shelves, positioned to capture the open pages of the record book. He had removed the camera and kept it. He had waited to see if whoever had placed it would return for it, and when they had not, he understood that they had simply moved on to a different method. He had then gone through the record books with the attention and memory that 4 years of intimate familiarity with the collection gave him, and he had identified exactly which pages contained the most sensitive information, the pages that, if extracted and passed on, would do the most damage. And then he had removed them himself, carefully, over many weeks, in an order that followed no obvious pattern so that the loss would not be detected quickly. He had brought them down to the hidden room, which he had found years ago while doing a structural survey of the library, and had told no one about because it had not, at that time, seemed relevant. He had kept the pages there, safe, while he worked on the only other part of the problem he could address without a voice, building evidence. He had documented everything he could observe. He had noted dates, times, the behavior of the staff members he had identified as responsible, 3 people who worked in rotating shifts that gave them occasional access to the East Wing. He had cross-referenced their access logs against the dates when he had found evidence of tampering. He had, over 7 months, in complete silence and complete isolation, assembled a case so thorough that it required almost no interpretation. The page he had been holding against his chest when they found him was the last one, the one he had always intended to be the final piece of evidence, the one that contained a detail so specific that no innocent explanation existed for its removal. Rio took the page. He read it. He went very still. Then he opened his folder and began comparing what the page contained against the access records he had pulled from the security room, and within 4 minutes he looked up and said, with the flat certainty of someone who has just confirmed what they already suspected, "These are the same 3 names." Nobody spoke for a moment. The room held the specific silence of people sitting with the weight of what they have just understood. Then Zane, who had been progressively less able to contain himself throughout the entire explanation, leaned forward with an expression of such genuine and unguarded admiration that it briefly rearranged the atmosphere of the room entirely. He said, with complete sincerity, "You solved the entire thing, alone, without being able to say one single word, before we had even been here a week." Ren looked at him, picked up his pen, wrote, "That is a low bar. This mansion has very average people." Zane sat back and laughed, the kind of laugh that is surprised out of the person rather than chosen, and the sound of it in the cold underground room was so entirely incongruous and so entirely warm that even Kaito, who was already reading through the accumulated evidence with focused intensity, paused for a moment and almost smiled. Haru stayed with Ren while the others went to handle Elder Toada and the 3 staff members. He sat nearby, close enough to be present and far enough away to give Ren space, and brought tea that was actually warm, because Haru was the kind of person who, when he decided to take care of someone, did it with thoroughness and without making a production of it. They sat in a comfortable quiet that was, for the first time in Ren's 4 years in the mansion, a quiet that contained someone else in it. Haru said gently, without pressing, "You have been carrying this alone for 7 months. That is a very heavy thing to carry." Ren wrote, without looking up, "There was nobody to carry it with." Haru looked at the top of Ren's head for a moment. Then he said, in the same gentle and certain tone, "There is now, if you want." Ren did not write anything back, but he did not close his notebook either, which was for Ren Ashida the equivalent of an answer. The days that followed were different from everything that had come before them. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone watching from the outside, but inside the library and inside the 5 Alphas' daily routines, something had reorganized itself around a new center. Rio began citing Ren's documentation in his formal reports to Elder Toada, including Ren's name each time. This was not a small thing. In 4 years at the mansion, Ren's work had never been attributed to him in any official communication. It had simply existed, like the library itself, assumed, relied upon, and unnamed. The first time Elder Toada read a report that said, according to Ren Ashida's cataloging records, he paused and read the name again. Kaito began leaving books on Ren's desk in the evenings, always when Ren was not there, always without explanation. They were not random choices. They were the books that Kaito had quietly observed Ren gravitating towards, the ones he reached for between tasks, the ones he held slightly differently from the others. The selections were precise in a way that demonstrated more careful attention than most people paid to anything. Ren always read them, and he always returned them with small paper stars tucked into the pages, folded with the same precision he applied to everything. Kaito kept them in the inner pocket of his coat. Sora's sign language improved with a speed that was frankly impressive, driven by the kind of motivation that does not require external encouragement because it comes from somewhere internal and certain. His evening sessions in the library grew longer. The conversations he and Sora had, slow at first, constrained by Sora's still limited vocabulary, then gradually more expansive as his vocabulary grew, ranged across topics that had nothing to do with the case, the mansion, or the Toada family. They talked about books. They talked about what kind of sky each of them preferred. Sora liked dawn, Ren liked the hour just before dark when the light went horizontal and made everything look as though it were being seen for the last time. They talked about small things and large things with equal care, and each conversation left Ren with the feeling of having been genuinely listened to, which was an experience so unfamiliar that for the first 3 weeks he could not stop turning it over in his mind after Sora left each night. But the peace was not permanent. Ogawa, the staff member who had been dismissed as one of the 3 responsible, made a final move before he was escorted from the grounds. He went to Elder Toada and delivered a different account of events. In this version, Ren had not been protecting the pages, he had been holding them as leverage, keeping sensitive information hidden and accessible to himself as a form of personal security, ensuring that the family could never dismiss or dispose of him as long as he had access to information they needed back. It was, as accusations went, internally consistent. It was also, in the specific way that the most dangerous lies are dangerous, built on a framework of truth. Ren had removed the pages. Ren had hidden them. Ren had told no one. The false part was the reason. Elder Toada sent a formal summons for Ren to appear before him the following morning. The 5 Alphas found out that evening, not from Elder Toada, he had not told them, but from one of the household staff who had overheard the summons being delivered and who mentioned it to Zane when Zane was in the kitchen for the 2nd time that day. Zane went immediately to find the others. They gathered in their shared room and had the shortest significant conversation any of them had ever participated in. Kaito laid out the situation. No one raised objections. No one needed to discuss motivations or weigh options. The decision was, in the way that genuinely unanimous decisions always are, less a choice and more a recognition, an acknowledgement of something they had all already arrived at separately without quite saying it. They were going to that meeting, all of them, standing beside Ren, not behind Elder Toada. Not because they had been asked to, not because they had been ordered, but because some things are simply the right thing to do, and everyone in the room understood that without needing it explained.
The morning of the meeting, Ren woke early, as he always did. He washed his face, put on his coat, tucked his notebook into his pocket. He stood at the window of his small east wing room for a moment and looked out at the grounds, where the autumn had progressed far enough that most of the trees were bare, and the sky was the pale, flat gray of a day that has not yet decided what it wants to be. He had spent 4 years inside this building, going where he was directed, doing what was required of him, keeping himself as small and as unobtrusive as possible, because smallness had always been the safest shape to take. He had told himself, on most days, that this was simply how his life was arranged, and that arrangement was not a tragedy. But standing at the window that morning, with the summons from Elder Toada sitting in his mind like a stone, he understood that he was frightened, genuinely,
specifically frightened, in a way that went beyond the immediate situation. He was frightened of being disbelieved. He was frightened of the particular kind of injustice that happens when a person who has done everything right is found guilty by a process that never intended to find them innocent. He walked to Elder Toada's meeting room alone. Or at least, he walked there alone. The corridor that led to the meeting room was long and made of cold gray stone, and he was halfway down it when he heard footsteps behind him, not one set of footsteps, but 5, moving at a pace that matched his exactly. He stopped, turned around slowly. Kaito was at the front, walking with the same unhurried certainty he brought to every room he entered. Zane was beside him, for once not eating anything, his expression carrying a seriousness that sat on him like a slightly unfamiliar coat, but fit him nonetheless. Haru walked a half-step behind, his large and steady presence filling the corridor with the particular quality of calm that very grounded people carry with them the way others carry tension. Rio had a folder under his arm and the look of someone who is already prepared for every possible version of the next 20 minutes, and Sora was at the far left, closest to Ren's side, and when Ren turned and saw him, Sora simply signed, in the easy, natural way he had developed over weeks of practice, a single phrase: "We are coming with you." Ren looked at all 5 of them. His notebook was in his hand. He did not write anything. He turned back toward the meeting room and continued walking, and the 5 of them fell into step around him, Kaito at his right, Sora at his left, the others arranged behind, and they walked the rest of the corridor together. Elder Toada was sitting at the head of a long table when the door opened and all 6 of them filed in. He had expected one person. He looked at the 5 who had entered along with that one person and was quiet for a moment with the specific expression of a man who is recalibrating a situation he thought he had controlled. He said that he had called for the library worker, not all of them. Kaito looked at him with the kind of calm that is not the absence of force, but its most disciplined form. He said, "We go where Ren goes." The name landed in the room differently than it would have an hour ago, because it was the first time any of the 5 Alphas had said it in front of Elder Toada, and the choice of name over title, Ren, not the library worker, not the mute boy, not the Omega from the East Wing, was a statement so precise and so complete that Elder Toada, who was a man of considerable intelligence and experience, understood it entirely. He looked at Ren. He did not look away. He said, "I've been told some things about the events of the past weeks. I want to hear your account." Rio opened his folder before Ren had finished reaching for his notebook. He had not waited for permission because the situation did not call for waiting. It called for the immediate establishment of a factual baseline before any narrative could take hold. He laid out the timeline clearly and without flourish, when Ren had found the camera, what he had done with it, the dates of the page removals cross-referenced with the evidence Ren had compiled, the names of the 3 responsible staff members, the access records that confirmed those names, and the photographic documentation that Ren had assembled over 7 months in complete silence and complete isolation. He presented each piece in logical order, the way a very good argument presents itself, each point supporting the next, nothing left ambiguous, nothing dependent on inference when evidence was available. Elder Toada listened to all of it without speaking. He looked at the documents, he looked at the timeline, he looked at Ren, who was sitting very still with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes steady, and his notebook closed, because he had decided that he was not going to perform nervousness for an audience, or allow his body to apologize for the truth it was defending. When Rio finished, Elder Toada was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked directly at Ren and asked the question that had been waiting underneath everything else. "Why did you not come to me directly?" Ren opened his notebook. He wrote carefully in the even, unhurried hand he used when the words needed to carry exactly the weight he intended them to carry. He wrote for nearly a minute. Then he slid the notebook across the table to Sora, who picked it up and read it aloud in a steady, clear voice that did not waver. "Because I am mute, I am not always believed when my account of events conflicts with someone who can speak. Because I came to this house as a souled worker, with no official standing, my word has no formal weight against a long-term employee. Because I am quiet, it is easy for people to assume I have nothing important to say. I had no guarantee that going to you directly would produce a different outcome than going to anyone else, because the first thing you would have asked me is to explain myself, and explanation requires trust, and trust requires a foundation I was never given the chance to build. So I did the only thing I knew would work, regardless of whether I was believed. I let the evidence speak for itself. Evidence cannot be dismissed the way I can." The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens after something true and difficult has been said plainly in a room full of people who understand exactly what it means. Elder Toada sat with it. He was not a soft man, and he was not a sentimental one, and the expression on his face was not guilt exactly, but it was something in the same family. The expression of a person confronting the gap between how they believed they had treated someone and how they had actually treated them. He looked at the notebook for a long time. Then he looked at Ren. "You protected this family, at significant personal risk, with no guarantee of recognition or safety." Ren reached across the table and took his notebook back. He wrote one more line. Sora read it. "I did it because it was right, not because I expected a reward." Elder Toada was quiet for one more long moment. Then he made 3 decisions, stated in the direct and final way he stated everything that was not open for discussion. First, Ren's status in the household was to be changed immediately and permanently. He would no longer be a souled worker with no standing. He would be a protected and paid professional with a formal signed contract, a salary, and the explicit right to leave the mansion whenever he chose. His role in the library would remain his for as long as he wanted it, and would end whenever he decided it should. Second, the 5 Alphas were to be formally and officially assigned to Ren's team, not as guards, not as keepers or supervisors, but as colleagues, partners, people operating as equals in the same space, with shared authority over the library's security and the safety of its contents. Third, he asked Ren whether he would like the library named in his honor. Ren's response was the last thing written in the notebook that morning, and it was in its way the most revealing thing he had said since they found him in the hidden room. He wrote, "A library belongs to everyone who reads in it. It needs no name." The meeting ended. All 6 of them walked back down the long, cold corridor, and the walk felt entirely different from the one that had preceded it, not because anything about the corridor had changed, but because everyone walking through it was different now, in the small and permanent way that people change after something important has been resolved. The weeks that followed were the first weeks of a different kind of life for Ren Ashida.
It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen loudly. It happened the way real things happen, slowly, in small increments, through the accumulation of ordinary moments that are individually unremarkable and collectively everything. Haru brought plants into the library, small ones in simple pots, positioned near the windows that Ren had never opened before and now kept open in the afternoons. The plants required occasional attention, which gave Haru a reason to be in the library daily that was separate from any other purpose, and the two of them developed a quiet habit of existing in the same space in the late afternoon, Ren at his desk and Haru tending to his plants, neither of them needing to fill the silence because the silence had long since stopped being empty. Rio, against all expectations, asked Ren to review his filing system, not because it needed improving, Rio's system was already excellent, but because he had realized, working with Ren's documentation over the past weeks, that there were structural choices Ren made in organizing information that Rio did not fully understand and wanted to. This was for Rio an extraordinary concession. He was not a person who admitted knowledge gaps comfortably. The fact that he admitted this one to Ren and sat across the desk from him for several afternoons as Ren walked him through the logic with patient, precise notes was its own form of respect. Ren never told anyone he had done this. Ren never mentioned it. But Rio's reports after those sessions used a slightly different organizational structure, and anyone who had paid attention to both would have noticed. Zane, in his characteristically direct way, simply decided that the library was now one of his preferred locations in the mansion. He brought snacks, he fell asleep in the reading chairs regularly. He somehow always woke up exactly before Ren was about to start the shelving work that required moving around the room, which suggested he was not deeply asleep as he appeared. He and Ren developed a wordless routine around this. Ren never disturbed him, Zane never pretended he had not been sleeping, and on the occasions when Zane woke up and found a cup of tea at his elbow that had not been there when he dozed off, he never commented on it either. They understood each other in the particular way that two people who do not share a spoken language can nonetheless develop an entirely fluent communication. Kaito's books continued to appear on the desk. The selections became, over time, slightly more personal, not just books Ren reached for at work, but books that responded to things Ren had written in passing, small references in notes and messages that Kaito had clearly not missed. Ren began to understand that Kaito's attention was not a general quality, it was specific, directed, and precisely aimed. He missed nothing about Ren. He had filed it all away and was drawing on it with a consistency that in its quiet way was the most intimate thing Ren had ever experienced. The paper stars accumulated in Kaito's coat pocket until they made a soft, small sound when he moved. And Sora continued to come every evening, and his sign language reached the point where their conversations no longer needed to be slow or careful or limited by vocabulary. They talked now like people talk when they have found someone whose wavelength matches their own, jumping between topics, referencing things said in earlier conversations, disagreeing comfortably, and resolving it without drama. One evening in the deep end of winter, when the library was very warm from the heat panels and very quiet from the snow falling outside the windows Haru had insisted on keeping maintained, Sora signed something that he had been composing and revising in his head for approximately 3 weeks. "You are my favorite person I have ever met." The words appeared in the air between them, formed by Sora's hands, received by Ren's eyes, and Ren sat with them for a long moment before he responded. His hands moved slowly and with great care, because what he wanted to say mattered, and he wanted to say it correctly. "You learned my language. Nobody has ever done that. That is the most important thing anyone has ever done for me." Haru, who was across the room, pretending to examine whether one of his plants needed water, it did not need water, and he knew it did not need water, and everyone in the room understood that he was pretending, turned his face away, and busied himself with the plant's leaves with excessive concentration. Zane was asleep in the reading chair, or had been. One eye opened briefly and then closed again very quickly. A short time later there was a suspicious brightness at the outer edge of his closed eyelid that he would have indignantly denied was moisture had anyone been rude enough to point it out.
Rio, who was sitting at the far end of the desk reviewing documents, did not look up, but his pen stopped moving for approximately 12 seconds, which for Rio was an equivalent of a significant emotional response. Kaito was standing near the door, where he had been for the last 20 minutes in the way he often stood near the library door in the evenings, not quite entering, not quite leaving, present in the particular way that people are present when a place has become important to them without them having fully decided to let it. He looked at Ren across the warm and lamplit room, and Ren looked back at him, and neither of them signed anything or wrote anything or spoke. But Ren's expression, the one that had been, for 4 years, careful and contained and calibrated to show only what was safe to show, was different. It was open in a way that it had not been before. It was not fragile, it was simply honest in the way that a person is honest when they have finally stopped spending energy on the performance of not feeling what they feel. The library held all 6 of them in its warm light. The books stood in their ordered rows. The plants breathed quietly in the corners. Outside, snow continued to fall in the way it always falls when it has nowhere in particular to be, without hurry, without direction, simply present and soft, and covering everything in a layer of white that made the world look, at least for the length of a winter evening, like something that had been carefully and specifically arranged for the people inside it. Ren looked around the room, at Zane in his chair with his suspicious eyelid, at Haru and his perfectly healthy plant, at Rio and his still pen, at Sora, who was smiling the way he smiled when something had gone exactly as he hoped, at Kaito in the doorway, steady and present and exactly where he was supposed to be. And then Ren Ashida, who had never in his life made a sound, who had built an entire world out of silence and had protected it for 4 years with remarkable and solitary diligence, smiled. Not a small, careful, contained smile, a real one, the kind that starts somewhere deeper than the face and works its way upward, the kind that belongs to people who have stopped bracing for the good thing to be taken away. It was the last image the story needed to give. It was in every way that mattered enough. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling us which character you connected with most and why. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their silence does not make them invisible. It makes them someone worth truly listening to.